I am officially recording this to the cloud. And then Casey, can you manage the waiting room?
Yes.
Very cool. All right. All right. So on behalf of the Harry Bridges Center for Labor Studies and of course the Labor Solidarity Project at UW-T, I'd like to welcome everyone back to our fall seminar series, Labor Strikes Back. And we've got an outstanding guest tonight who's joining us to share his work on urban development and the neoliberal turn in New York City. And as you know, I'm a real believer, if you've taken classes with me, in the saying that you kind of can't plan your future without first knowing your past. And I think tonight's guest really does an excellent job of explaining how we've arrived at where we are by exploring a crucial period in the history of American urban development. I think in the process, it traces many of the crises that we face today back to their infancy in that, the neoliberal turn of the 1970s and the 1980s. Affordable housing, the criminalization of homelessness, the privatization of just about everything, the militarization of law enforcement, the surveillance state, and then of course, the carceral state that those things gave birth to. These are, in my opinion, the issues that really kind of frame the organizing and the advocacy work that we do today. And they really kind of emerged during this moment. And I think, understanding this history is really an essential first step to reversing the damage that it's done over what's now, the last 50 years. And though our guest focuses mainly on New York City, it's not just New York City, it's really any major metropolitan area. Our metropolitan areas, Seattle, Tacoma, these are effects that, began in the East Coast and sort of have worked their way out west. And I think, of course, fighting back here means more than just learning the history. Within the theme of this seminar, it means coming together, as workers, as neighbors, and as citizens, and, working together and organizing for change, which involves also, recognizing that we all have a stake in this larger shared fight, right? And learning how to leverage the strength that comes through that kind of solidarity. And I think, by looking back, we can also realize that we're sort of participating in a tradition of resistance. And it's a tradition of resistance that I think tonight's guest really documents in his work. So please join me in extending a warm digital welcome to Dr. Benjamin Holtzman, who's an assistant professor of history at Lehman College, which is part of the City University of New York system, the CUNY system. He's the author of the excellent book, The Long Crisis, New York City and the Path to Neoliberalism. He's also published work in the Washington Post, Shelter Force, Public Books, and Jacobin. And he's currently working on a second book, which I am excited to hear about too, Smash the Klan, Fighting the White Power Movement in the Late 20th Century. So just thank you for joining us this evening. Thanks to, for staying up with us out there on the East Coast, where you're 3 hours ahead. Really excited to, share this work with our campus and our community. And I'm kind of, particularly excited, selfishly so, of course, to think about how your work kind of illuminates things that we've seen out here, in Seattle or Tacoma. And also excited, again, if we've got time for maybe a sneak preview of this next project, which sounds really exciting. So we're gonna stick to our typical format, which will involve a presentation, and then we're going to reserve time for a Q&A after the fact. We got a number of amazing questions submitted by students ahead of time, but if you've got questions that pop up during the presentation, just feel free to type them into the chat, and we'll try to work our way through them after the fact. So with all of that being said, thanks again to Dr. Benjamin Holtzman for joining us this evening.
Great, thank you so much. I am gonna start off by just getting the PowerPoint going. Let's see here before I start saying too much. Okay, I'm assuming that is coming through and all right for everybody. Great, thanks so much. So yeah, so let me just say, thank you all for being here. I'm really grateful for you taking time out of your Wednesday evening to be a part of this, what I hope first presentation and then conversation. So I'm going to talk for I like to follow instructions. I was told to talk for about 40 minutes, and then I hope that will give plenty of time for us to have a conversation and a dialogue. And I'm looking forward to what all of you have to say. And of course, I want to say too, thank you so much to Professor Alex Miller, who did so much to organize this event, this fantastic series that I'm so thrilled to be a part of, and really appreciate all of his time and labor in coordinating this event. So thanks, so much gratitude to him. So I'm going to start a bit by kind of giving an overview of the book. So tonight I'm really thrilled to be discussing research from my book, The Long Crisis, New York City and the Path to Neoliberalism. So what I'm trying to do in this project is explore the origins and implications of one of the more significant political developments of the last 50 years, the increasing reliance on the market and private sector for realms of life that had previously been the domain of government. So this is a shift that's not just happened in New York and across the country, but really even across the world, from things like privatizing water systems to spreading private security on public streets. So this kind of marketization, which is a term I use to refer to the growth of the private sector market really across public life, has really led to major changes in local and national governance. When I began this project, most of the, so I'm a historian, and most of the historians who had really thought about this, increasing reliance on the market and private sector in the late 20th century, had really overwhelmingly portrayed this shift as coming about due to the rise of the political right and conservatives. Historians have really depicted the growth of market policies as deriving from the steady and dogged work of conservative politicians and business sector, libertarians, free market economists, those kind of folks. And they give us a really rich portrait of the work that the political right has done. But in The Long Crisis, I take a different approach. I tried to ask, what do we mean to think about the growth of market policies, not as simply deriving from powerful national figures who were driven by clear pro-market visions and ideologies, but as a process that unfolded locally, was influenced by local residents and local democratic officials who often lacked any particular proclivity toward market solutions. I tried to ask what it would mean to examine this transformation through the experiences of city dwellers on the ground, by focusing on how they were both affected by and really ultimately came to shape the political economy. So I look at these questions in New York City. And New York is a really kind of especially notable setting for examining this transformation, because it was for decades at mid-century really recognized as having some of the strongest tenets of social democracy. It's kind of government-centered solutions, really in the entire United States, a really robust municipal government. But beginning in the 1960s, the city entered into a prolonged period of economic decline. And this led to accompanying constraints on what New Yorkers believed was possible from government. So in the book, I look at how, as a result of this kind of economic constraints, beginning in the late 60s, New Yorkers began to launch imaginative remedies to local crises that this economically battered government seemed no longer able to solve. By exploring changes in the political economy, from the ground up, I found that New Yorkers began to embrace a kind of ethos of volunteerism and eventually a partnership with private businesses to try to sustain key areas of urban life. Liberal and democratic policymakers came to see such alliances not as kind of stopgap temporary solutions, but over time as more kind of legitimate and permanent features of modern governance, moving the city away from those kind of mid-century institutions of liberal government and toward a greater dependence on the private sector and market. And as public services became private ones, race and class inequalities commonly grew. So the book is trying to recast, the role of Democrats and liberals and residents is really kind of essential to this market turn in the late 20th century. So far from bit players, I argue that local Democrats and liberals, those on the left, we're navigating changing economic conditions by supporting a variety of initiatives that were bubbling up from below in New York that were looking towards private sector and the market as solutions. Over time, democratic officials really reconceptualized the public sector as being really central to the delivery of city services. So in the book, The Long Crisis, actors currently at the periphery of scholarship, from local democratic officials to everyday residents, really move to the center of the narrative. And the shift does more than highlight the underacknowledged role of local actors and Democrats in marketization. It illustrates how this process, percolated up from below, oftentimes in ways unintended, rather than simply being imposed by conservative elites. So Long Crisis offers a new kind of origin story for the market turn of the late 20th century by demonstrating how local people and officials help build neoliberalism from the ground up. My work also illustrates how over time, wealthy residents and those within the business sector used opportunities created by this market turn to shape city life in ways that would be to their advantage, again, often exacerbating racial inequalities across city life in the process. So in the book, I focus especially on what I call livable spaces, housing and public space. So these were areas that were, kind of really central to residents' lives, is where they lived, where they worked, where they sought comfort, interacted with loved ones, those kinds of things. And they were also spaces that provoked particular alarm as they declined in ways the municipal government seemed really no longer able to fix. So I detail how New Yorkers responded by pushing for new solutions to the problems affecting these kinds of realms. These came from city dwellers who often professed, little ideological allegiance to the superiority of market solutions, but whose actions nonetheless pushed the city in that direction. There were, for example, activists who sought to improve access to affordable housing by emphasizing self-help and individual ownership over government resources, which I talk about in chapter 1. And there were also residents in moderate and middle-income neighborhoods who were so concerned with growing crime that they came together to patrol city streets or hire private guards and really remaking policing in the city, which I talk about in chapter 4. So, New Yorkers who really believed in the market solutions were also really important to the market turn. These were, often coming from realms like business and real estate, and they, made clear that the marketization wasn't, simply a grassroots process. But I really found, in working on the book, that while tracing the, important role of those kind of actors throughout the narrative, that their actions initially, largely followed the path that were forged by these less ideologically committed New Yorkers, rather than, kind of shaping the direction. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to focus especially on one of the narratives of my book, which is about parks. So how New Yorkers responded to declining conditions in parks. So I'm going to talk a bit about why parks were critical to understanding marketization, that move to the private sector and market, and then discuss a series of campaigns that try to kind of illustrate how this process of moving to the market in the private sector kind of took place over several decades. So these are campaigns around local parks, and then Central Park, which some of you, many of you, I don't know, may have heard of, the big one in New York, then a park called Bryant Park, which again kind of together chronicle how these public spaces opened up opened up parks, how these public spaces increasingly opened up to the private sector and market. Okay, so I got interested in parks for a couple different reasons. Parks have, as a historian, it's clear parks have long had an essential role in American life. The proponents and designers who created urban parks in the 19th century recognized the need for spaces for reflection and recreation. Second, parks have long had a kind of physical, local, or they've long been, I should say, a highly local, physical, and highly visible representation of government. They're a tangible representation of government's role in maintaining a public good, right? One that's supposed to be accessible and beneficial to all. But at the same time, in recent decades, parks have really become a principal site in which private sector and market forces have expanded. And if we want to understand what the market turned, we should look to public goods, what's happened to them, how it's happened, and what the effects have been. And so there's been a real transformation in public parks. Parks have gone from being run by local government to being managed by private organizations. And this has happened in cities across the country, from Miami to Anchorage. So on this map, what I've outlined in New York, and just focusing on Manhattan, the parks for which nonprofit, private organizations raise money for and are responsible for part or even all of the day-to-day and long-term operation of parks. And what's happened here in New York is representative of a larger transformation of a public good that really, had been understood as like the exclusive responsibility of government, becoming more and more entrusted to these private organizations, right? And New York might be the kind of leading example of this, but this has, happened in a lot of places and is also, happening in places like Seattle. So on this map, I've noted how in recent years, the two green spaces, two public spaces, Occidental Square and West Side Lake, those are noted in green, that since 2015 have been managed by a privately run business group, the Downtown Seattle Association. I've noted three other green spaces for which the Downtown Seattle Association provides management guidance. And also in just highlighted a little bit in yellow is Waterfront Park, which will, as I understand it, fully open in a couple years, which is funded by a local improvement district and operated by a private-public partnership, the Friends of Seattle Waterfront. So I'll talk about how in New York, this change in who governs these kinds of public spaces has really shaped park resources, access, and services across race and class, representing a pretty critical and largely overlooked issue of racial and class inequality in the late 20th century and through till today. So in order to understand how this happened in New York and across the country, we need to go back to New York in the 1960s. These park groups in New York that ultimately form are really recognized as being the kind of models for this being reproduced in cities across the country. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the first part, or maybe this is even several parts along the way, but this local park revitalization process. So by the 1960s in New York, complaints about parks had really become widespread. User surveys consistently found that New Yorkers were frustrated with park conditions, a sentiment within lower income communities of color, as well as middle income white ones. And as the city entered a major economic downturn in the late 60s, which would continue for well over a decade, park conditions further declined. These deteriorated conditions, really alarmed park advocates and officials, who even began to suggest that some parks might need to be completely shuttered. But throughout city neighborhoods, residents began work on a different solution, improving parks themselves. In the late 1960s, residents began to believe that the city could no longer care for parks as it once had. And in response, residents throughout New York formed grassroots groups to supplement declining city resources. So in Manhattan's Yorkville, for example, residents had grown so frustrated by the continued decline of their local Greens ward that they formed the Carl Schurz Park Association in the late 60s, quote, on the premise that community involvement is the key to securing a well-maintained park. Membership quickly grew into the thousands, with members volunteering and contributing a $5 yearly fee to fund supplies. Nearby, on the border of East Harlem, residents came together to transform a shuttered municipal asphalt plant into a park. Volunteers raised hundreds of thousands of dollars, with an average contribution of just $14. They hauled away 12 tons of garbage. And they explained that their goal was for the facility, quote, to be created and thereafter maintained as a public recreation park with private funds. And with municipal cutbacks really ongoing into the early 70s, the group believed that a change had occurred. Park rehabilitation needed to be undertaken by community members themselves. So these two examples were really representative of a larger movement of neighbors coming together to revitalize green spaces. Community members described the necessity of volunteerism as local government could no longer provide the support it had. Quote, "We have to take matters into our own hands," as one resident said. Now, these kind of local initiatives were, of course, shaped by residents and communities' larger relationship with government. Municipal services like parks were maintained at lower levels within communities of color. And the diminished park conditions that many middle-income white communities began to experience in the 60s were along what lower-income communities and African-American communities and Puerto Rican communities had grappled with. But what's also striking is how widespread these community revitalization efforts became in the late 60s and early 70s, appearing within lower-income communities of color as well as middle-income white ones. Their efforts were really part of this kind of spirit of localism that's taking hold in the city at this time. The impetus was, due to a lot of factors from, Black power and community control ideologies in communities of color to Jane Jacobs' inspired critiques of massive renewal projects. But then, really catalyzed by the decline in municipal resources, that becomes the real spur for across the city, residents beginning to take a more active role in improving local conditions. So these park groups, rarely asked for anything more from the city. That really seemed improbable amidst these budget cutbacks. But these groups really reflected the beginnings of a new kind of common sense that was emerging. Government could not provide the service that it had, and it was necessary for those outside government to take on, to be able to meet this gap. So community involvement also spread for years before the city began to lend support to them. In 1973, Liberal Mayor John Lindsay established the Office of Park Partnerships, quote, "to bring park groups directly into the process of running, planning, and programming neighborhood parks." This opening of a terrain that had previously been exclusive to government really marked a major change apparent in liberal officials' attitudes by the early 70s, right? After, as they themselves are struggling with declining municipal budgets for years, they began shifting towards encouraging these initiatives that residents and the private sector were increasingly launching to fill in for government. And commonly, it's these community groups, community members who were the ones who were pushing these weary officials to open up areas of government control to volunteers and even private sector involvement. So these grassroots groups were also ongoing for years before the city's fiscal position really hit its lowest point in the mid-1970s. At that time, financial institutions refused to underwrite additional municipal bonds, ushering in a period known as the fiscal crisis in 1975. State and federal officials, along with financial and business elites, ultimately intervened. New York basically almost goes bankrupt at this point, but the kind of financial elites who take control of the city at this time impose really enact even additional cutbacks on municipal services. And these cuts would help to deepen after 1975, deepen in the public mind that local government just can't be counted on as before. So in the wake of the fiscal crisis, this enthusiasm for and even the stakes of resident efforts grew. You have Democratic Mayor A. Beam ratcheting up support for volunteerism, proclaiming that parks are only going to, quote, survive if they continue to tap the last great resource of the city, its people. And the leading park advocacy group formed a Volunteers in Parks program as, quote, budget cuts made it apparent that users of city parks would have to assume greater responsibility for their care. So what I'm trying to show is how beginning in the late 1960s, we see this new belief spreading across New York. Right? City government can no longer provide the services that it once had. And in response, there's thousands of residents who are developing projects like these grassroots park groups to push for outside involvement. Liberal and Democratic officials overcame their initial skepticism to proclaim initiatives to supplement these municipal services as essential. And these actions reflected the emergence of a new kind of common sense, that it was necessary for New Yorkers outside government to take on a greater role. So over the next few years, the notion that parks needed more support from outside government increased. Critically, the solutions also expanded from just volunteerism to looking more towards elites to take on a greater role in funding and even running parks. These took a little bit of time to gain support, but they really do so through proponents who targeted the city's most iconic park, Central Park. And so I'm going to talk about that campaign next. So Central Park had been, since its opening in 1873, New York's most famous and frequently visited park. But in the 1960s, like those other parks across the city, its conditions really began to decline substantially. And the groups that began to form around Central Park were catalyzed by the same notion that motivated community efforts. Parks needed greater support from outside government. The first of these groups, the Central Park Task Force, formed in 1974. Its organizers believed in the tenets of urban liberalism, but the park's deteriorating conditions led the group and its executive director, Betsy Barlow, to begin broadcasting that the park needed greater support amidst government cutbacks. Quote, "Abandon Central Park?" asked the cover of one task force pamphlet. "Never," the next page answered. Years of municipal cutbacks had left Central Park, quote, "in trouble. It needs help. Your help," the pamphlet continued. Barlow's work started to generate thousands of volunteers and small donations over the next few years. By 1976, the group was featured in a cover article Barlow wrote for New York Magazine entitled 32 Ways Your Time or Money Can Rescue Central Park. With this sort of fairly aggressive cover. I don't know. So, quote, "New York can no longer afford its parks," the article began bluntly, "not even Central Park." The article was not a call to arms for increased government support of parks. Instead, Barlow wrote that, quote, "the survival or ultimate death of cities' parks relied on volunteerism and private donations." Barlow and local groups had promoted a similar message for years in the city. But especially in the wake of the 1975 fiscal crisis, where the city nearly goes bankrupt, the notion that local government alone could not be counted on as before really took on even broader meaning. So the article also reflected how the task force began expanding the target of its message, from everyday users to the affluent and philanthropic classes. Barlow hoped that the article will allow elite donors to see that the park was a New York institution on par with things like the Metropolitan Museum. In addition to volunteer opportunities, the article included a range of costly rehabilitation projects she believed necessary that could be funded by these affluent New Yorkers. Now, despite Barlow's success, her work didn't outpace the continued municipal cutbacks. Between 1973 and 1977, for example, park funding from the city actually declines by 2/3. So it's in real trouble. But with more cutbacks, that only helps to really deepen the notion that the park was being lost in city hands. Some officials, like New York Senator Daniel Moynihan, even began to propose that the city have to transfer responsibility for Central Park to the federal government or maybe the state government, right? That begins to be seriously debated in the late 70s. So the idea that the city might lose the park to another area of government really provokes a lot of anxiety amongst park advocates and local officials. At the same time, there's growing agreement that among officials, advocates, and media coverage that the city just does not have the resources to care for Central Park on its own. So they need to resolve these tensions between these two competing ideas, right? The city can't lose the park, but it can't afford the park. Brought greater attention to this innovative proposal from a group called the Central Park Community Fund. The Community Fund was formed in 1974 by two Wall Street men, Richard Gilder and George Soros, the same George Soros with whom many of you are probably familiar. Oops. And like the task force, the Community Fund had for years been promoting that because of cutbacks, volunteers and small donations were really necessary for the park's survival. But the task force also proposed two additional solutions: appointing a single administrator in charge of the park and a private board of guardians to secure bigger donations. So the task force had really been batting this idea around for a few years, but the proposal gained greater attention with a debate about moving Central Park to another area of government. It also received more support with the election of Democratic Mayor Ed Koch in 1978. Though prior liberal and Democratic mayors had increasingly embraced initiatives that were looking to citizens, the private sector, and the market, Koch really comes into office with a clear vision for the need to expand the role of the private sector and market in city governance. But these groups are still trying to compel Koch to really open up the park beyond city control, which hadn't happened yet. So both of these Central Park groups begin, point to their years of garnering volunteers and donations, and both groups are noting how they are beginning to have success and convincing philanthropists and other elites that a public park was really worthy of their contributions. And this success really raised the question for officials, right? Why should they do anything less than garner as much support that those outside government were willing to offer? So in 1979, Koch created the Central Park Administrator. He taps the task force, Betsy Barlow, for the position. He then supported the creation of a group called the Central Park Conservancy, which merged the Community Fund and task force to provide, quote, a unified voice within the private sector on behalf of the park. So these appointments, kind of bureaucratic appointments, are actually reflected, major political shifts. Never in the 20th century had the city turned to the private sector to fund the head of a public park, nor had an administrator and private organization formed to fundraise and manage those funds. This created a new governing structure represented by this kind of awkward flowchart in which the park's daily and future operations were increasingly shaped by this new, private, semi-private organization, the Central Park Conservancy. And that the Conservancy marked such a major change was evident even in its initial struggle to convince the wealthy individuals and corporations that their involvement was needed to support this new kind of model. As Conservancy folks are approaching financial and corporate leaders, they're encountering resistance from people who are saying things like parks are public property and should be supported by public money. Many viewed the request that the wealthy and businesses fill, government's fiduciary and fiscal roles as outlandish, right? There was that mentality, Barlow remembered, quote, aren't we taxpayers? So you kind of see how this logic about this new model, this need to increase the role of elites and the business sector, private sector, in this governance of public spaces had been growing for over a decade. But in many ways, it's really the elites that are kind of the last to come on board with this new model. But as the Conservancy begins facilitating park improvements, contributions really grow. Donors were assured that the Conservancy would supplement and not supplant municipal funding. And over the next few years, volunteers and small donations came to the park in greater number. But the largest portion of funds was increasingly coming from wealthy individuals and foundations who were contributing like $3 million over the first 2 years. So the Conservancy was this kind of culmination of over a decade of work to save parks by opening them up beyond government. The task force and community fund tapped into the sentiment that had fueled grassroots groups for years, that the future of parks depended on looking outside government and directed it towards the city's most recognized and arguably its most important park. The Conservancy really created this new model for providing a fundamental municipal service. Rather than a public park relying on the whim of government, private citizens in the private sector would provide financial support. And in return, they would gain a role in its management and future. This new model, of course, had limits in its reproducibility. The campaign around Central Park benefited from the connection. Many residents from throughout the city felt toward the park, but especially its neighbors, who increasingly began to see that the connection between, things like their own real estate values and the conditions within the park. So the park lays between, if you're less familiar with New York, totally understandable. It's between the Upper East Side, which is long home to the city's wealthiest residents, the Upper West Side, an area that was gentrifying in the 1970s, and above the Midtown major business district. And so the Central Park groups really are working to convince this close array of more elite residents that they should see the park as their own backyard. And over time, this backyard strategy, with all of the payoff that could come to donors, is increasingly works. But this tactic and this new model for supporting public parks was simply not possible for groups in working class communities and neighborhoods of color to replicate. The model, however, was taken up in more capital-rich areas of the city. So though the Conservancy took years of legwork, what's also striking is how once the door for expanding private involvement for parks in parks grew, or once that door opened, I should say, more extensive models took form really quickly, going from outside government or those outside government having a greater role in running parks to really outright privatization. A process that really can see happen with the Bryant Park Corporation, which is the last example that I'm going to talk about tonight. So the corporation, the Bryant Park Corporation, was formed in the early 1980s by the New York Public Library, whose famous main branch sits on Bryant Park's 9 acres in Midtown Manhattan. The corporation began seeking volunteers and donations for renovations and supplemental services and aimed to attract what they called more desirable users to the park. Like other parks in Manhattan business districts, most of the users deemed undesirable, those who slept or were reported to be selling drugs, were African-American men, heightening racialized fears about the danger that the park posed to the business district. In contrast, white office workers were labeled desirable users, even though they too were often engaged in illicit activities as the principal drug purchasers. Nonetheless, over the next few years, as the corporation began to undertake renovations, library administrators determined that the corporation needed, quote, to take the park away from Parks Department ownership and management, as its November 1982 board meeting notes recorded. They worked to convince the corporations whose headquarters surrounded the park that contributing to the park's rehabilitation would boost real estate values and employee recruitment, things like that. The Bryant Park Corporation also proposed that the blocks immediately surrounding the park be turned into a business improvement district, or a BID. BIDs were really this astonishing invention of the late 70s and 80s that have become widespread today and that I write about at several points in the book, and then I'm happy to talk more about afterwards. So what they do is they allow property owners within a designated district to enact a mandatory tax on all the owners and for the BID to then use that resulting tax at their discretion. So self-imposed tax that then these property owners can use however they like. In this case, they target it towards being able to run Bryant Park. And while the proposal to privatize the park alarmed some park advocates, the Koch administration and other local Democratic officials really overwhelmingly supported the idea. How could the city turn down the corporate sector willing to impose a voluntary tax upon itself to support a long-tarnished park, officials wondered, even if they asked to run the park in return? And that's what they agreed to do. So in 1985, city officials signed an unprecedented management agreement with the Bryant Park Corporation, allowing this private organization to take over nearly all park operations, effectively privatizing the park. The agreement, as one corporation official exclaimed, was, quote, a grand experiment in urban governance. So the Conservancy in Central Park, the corporation in Bryant Park, both reflected the kind of profound changes in government and public space that were happening in the 1980s and that will continue in subsequent years. Parks were reconceptualized from being understood as common property, protected by government, to spaces that could instead be safeguarded, even run, by resourced populations outside of government. This change marked a kind of endpoint of a transformation that had started decades earlier. This shift began with the sentiment that emerged in the late 60s that government could no longer adequately care for its parks. The notion catalyzed local park improvement groups to garner volunteers and small donations. Over the 1970s, the Central Park Task Force and Community Fund greatly built on this model. With the support of Democratic officials, these groups similarly looked at everyday users of parks, but over time, they worked to convince more wealthy residents and businesses that parks were worthy of their investment. And indeed, that this investment could pay personal and professional dividends through things like enhanced real estate values and tax deductions. And their success forged the path towards policy changes that empowered a private organization to fund and manage Central Park. The shift from public to private then culminated with the Bryant Park Corporation. So in the 1980s, groups like the Conservancy and Corporation were really heralded for their work by officials and in the media. They not only alleviated the fiscal and financial duties fiscal and fiduciary duties of city government, but the improvements they brought were credited with things like raising real estate values, attracting tourists, and appealing to the more moneyed residents who were increasingly moving to New York in the 1980s. And in the years ahead, these groups really would become the models for an array of organizations that formed to raise funds and gain control over parks, which officials continue to encourage. Now, there isn't a question, I think, that these groups undertook major physical enhancements and renovations that transformed these green spaces of the city. But less recognized are the costs of that have come from moving a public good toward the private sector and market, especially in terms of accompanying inequalities. And by tracing this shift, we can kind of help to see some of the ways that worsening racial and class-based inequalities of the late 20th century, extended to a variety of realms, of course, across beyond income, of course. So, for example, this shift gave private donors a greater role in shaping parks. As wealthy and corporations became guardians of parks, they often sought something in return. This led to an emphasis on features that donors who were overwhelmingly affluent and white tend to favor, passive activities and bucolic settings. And it diminished the importance of features preferred by more racially and economically diverse populations, from playgrounds to sports, which of course matter for who these green spaces serve. This process also allowed private operators to influence what kind of public access parks through more explicit means, such as the use of private security to push so-called undesirable populations, invariably poor people of color, out of these green spaces. This shift also transformed who performs the labor within these parks, significantly diminishing the reliance on the Parks Department, a unionized labor force, in favor of a non-unionized workforce of private park organizations. Beginning in the 1980s, for instance, in Central Park, the Conservancy switched from just promoting volunteerism to increasingly hiring its own workers as it took on greater and greater responsibility for the park, slowly replacing the unionized municipal workforce. Today, about 90% of the wage labor in the park is performed by the Conservancy's workforce, which, despite several organizing campaigns, remains non-unionized. Also, as nonprofit park groups became cachet charities, they garnered substantial donations. These tax-deductible contributions forego tax revenue and go to parks in affluent areas, often where donors live, furthering geographic concentrations of urban resources, geographic concentrations of urban resources. Additionally, this is the final point, as parks were reconceptualized as spaces that could be safeguarded by market forces in the 1980s and 90s, city leaders chopped away at the Parks Department budget. Officials encouraged the formation of private organizations to make up for this shortfall. In working class areas and areas of color, neighbors continued to organize around volunteerism and small-scale donations. But in capital-rich, whiter areas, conservancy-type organizations formed to insulate particular parks against cuts in public funding. So in this slide, I have just kind of briefly noting the decline in Parks Department funding from the mid-'80s to the mid-'90s, going from about $225 million to about $150 million, so pretty significant decline. And this slide is just noting the increase in private support for parks, accompanying the switch going from a few million in the mid-1980s, basically, to close to 30 million by the mid-1990s. Now, it might seem like that's making up for a significant amount of the shortfall, but we have to remember that's only going to a select few number of parks. And the result, or the kind of experience of this process in two parks in the Bronx, which is the northernmost borough of New York City, is instructive. So after several years of parks budgets declining at the end of the 1980s, two groups formed. One for Van Cortlandt Park, which is located near whiter and more affluent neighborhoods, and another for Pelham Bay Park, which is located in a much more racially and economically diverse area of the borough. Van Cortlandt Group quickly raised $100,000 over its first few years, enough to hire 18 full-time summer employees. The Pelham Bay Group, in contrast, struggled to raise significant sums and mostly relied on volunteers. The group soon disbanded, leaving the park cared for only by a staff of 13 city employees. In contrast with the Conservancy, there were over 350 workers in Central Park at that time, despite that park only being about a third as large. And the disparities of this two-tiered system largely worsened in the years ahead. Declining municipal funding meant that parks in working class and disproportionately of color areas lacked regular maintenance and upkeep. The result was a park system with, quote, vastly different levels of park services, as one report concluded in the early 2000s. The inequalities between really increasingly pristine parks supported by private organizations in affluent and whiter areas and poorly maintained parks in lower income neighborhoods of color became so vast that, as one advocacy group declared in 2006, it was tantamount to a civil rights issue. So I want to just conclude with some kind of additional thoughts on this history and what it means, and then looking forward to the conversation and questions. So the Long Crisis, the book, what I'm trying to do is trying to rethink the market turn in the late 20th century and how it happened. While historians have really depicted this turn toward the market and private sector as really emerging from the right side of American politics, the book is trying to show how the route to neoliberalism was much more homegrown, experimental, and shepherded by New Yorkers who were driven to improve local conditions. It took form through a process of popular marketization that transformed political and economic life from the ground up. Rather than simply being imposed from a narrow set of conservative elites, with striking regularity, urban dwellers took action without the kind of hostility toward liberalism or proclivity toward the market that scholars had argued really drove that process. This transformation definitely required the support of the affluent and business sectors, but it was one that very few within these realms initially saw. Nor was it one that emerged from the financial and government elites who commanded the city during the fiscal crisis. Rather, for parks, this process began in earnest in the late 60s with the widespread formation of neighborhood park groups. These groups emerged from the belief that the city was no longer capable of adequately caring for its parks. At first, perhaps just momentarily, but as economic conditions deteriorated indefinitely. The sentiment first found across neighborhoods soon spread to prominent park advocates, major parks, and officials. So the target is also switching from local groups to the city's most iconic park. Critically, Central Park advocates then expanded the proposed solutions from volunteerism and small donations to turning to the affluent to financially support and ultimately run the park. Yet the call for greater private involvement came primarily from a range of supporters without substantive pro-market motivations. Over the 1970s, a wide variety of neighborhood groups, park advocates, city officials, even institutions like the public library, labored to promote that continuing to open up parks to forces outside government was necessary to save them. Their actions expanded the role of private actors in the private sector in addressing services that really had been seen as exclusively government's responsibility. And their efforts weren't peripheral to the park system's market turn and the eventual support of this turn by the affluent and business elites. It was really constitutive to the process. This is a process that was also, really backed by liberal and democratic officials throughout this period. Beginning with the Lindsay administration in the early 1970s, officials switched from their initial resistance to opening these spheres that had been the domain of government to giving support for expanding outside involvement. Over the 1970s, the notion that successful governance really necessitated expanding the role of the private sector and market really became a defining feature of Democrat Ed Koch's administration. And chronicling this shift demonstrates not only the central role of Democrats and liberal officials in ushering in marketization, but also how Democratic Party politics transformed in the late 20th century. It illustrates how officials, were increasingly embracing market solutions at the local level, decades before this rose to a kind of central governing philosophy of the Democratic Party at the federal level under Bill Clinton. And so the story of parks reflects the kind of larger arguments of my book. By tracing how New Yorkers responded to problems like housing, crime, development, public space, and poverty, I show how these initiatives forged a path toward a greater dependence on the private sector and market. Over time, local officials backed policy changes that reinforced this dependence, a shift that those within the corporate and affluent spheres eventually embraced, especially because of how it could advantage them, such as by enhancing real estate values or employing their own private security forces. And as public services became private ones, race and class inequities grew. My work is trying to reveal or trying to demonstrate what's revealed by examining how political and economic developments really affected people on the ground and trying to, really take them seriously. Those circumstances of economic crisis really helped to shape everyday residents' very conception of who could provide services that had been understood as the exclusive domain of government. The historic record reveals a surprising and unexpected insight. Rather than retreat from public life or proclaim that government is the problem, residents and officials experimented with new kinds of initiatives to improve urban life. They fought austerity not by demanding more from government, but by trying to make up for the constraints on government with new kinds of initiatives. They catalyzed new approaches to how key services could be provided, and ultimately they remade the role of the private sector and market across city life. Tracing this process from the ground up reveals not just how the reliance on the private sector and market expanded over time, but how it did so in ways that have become so extensive in scope, durable over time. It helps us to understand the unlikely origins of key urban inequalities, how these developed, and how they continue to shape cities today. Thanks.
Stop. Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing this work. It is absolutely fascinating. Let's get a round of applause for our guest tonight. Thank you so much. Find my hand clapping emoji. Excellent. And again, if you've got questions, if you're on camera, you can clap. If you've got questions, again, go ahead and type them into the chat. I know one that I always like to start off with, and that generally I had a couple students pose questions ahead of time, and just curious about how this project came about, how you decided to focus on this particular topic, and then how you decided to approach this topic from the angles that you chose to take.
Yeah, no, it's a really great question. Again, and thank you all of you for sticking with that. I appreciate it. And also I hope it was, I had a fly buzzing around my head. I hope it wasn't too distracting to see me trying to swat it during the talk. I don't know where it came from. So yeah, so thank you all. I really appreciate it. So I grew a couple different ways to answer that, but I grew up outside of New York, in Long Island. And I am, I said that I was never going to work on a project that really covered New York during any period in which I lived. But I simultaneously, this project was based on my dissertation that I did in graduate school, and I kept kind of returning to some of the changes that I was seeing in New York, in the 90s. I mean, I'm kind of old. And really thinking about how the city seemed to be transforming so radically during that period. That was also the period in which Mayor Rudy Giuliani, who's now become famous for all sorts of different reasons, was the mayor of New York. And he was really widely credited with ushering in processes of things like privatization, selling off of government resources, trying to increase the private and market sector. He's really seen as the kind of pinnacle of that happening in the 1990s. And I think that as part of this process, I wanted to dig into the longer story of how these processes were at work and trying to see, I mean, I didn't necessarily set out to do this, but over time, that kind of made me think about Giuliani as almost the kind of endpoint to processes that began decades earlier. Right. And so that led me to kind of down this path of really thinking about, okay, if we kind of see Giuliani in the 1990s as him really accelerating processes of privatization and looking to the private sector and market, right? What is the kind of beginning point of these processes by going back to how New Yorkers responded to the kind of conditions that they were facing in the late 1960s? So that's kind of one way of going back to the dissertation, kind of really thinking about some of the even personal questions that I was curious about as somebody who was sort of growing up in and around New York, roughly toward the endpoint of where this project ends in the late 90s.
Nice. And when we talked before your presentation, I mentioned, I went to grad school in New York, and I actually grew up in New Jersey, well, central New Jersey. So a lot of these figures and characters in the book are, they're familiar names, and the policies I certainly experienced, at least from a distance or adjacent to. It's really fascinating. How, speaking of Giuliani, I'm curious because one of the ironies of your book sort of points at how, it was this series of liberal administrations that sort of pushed this marketization. So I'm curious just kind of how that looked once it got once Giuliani took over. After the keys were already handed to most of the corporations, how did a Giuliani administration differ from what came before?
Yeah, definitely. So he kind of steps on so what I'm trying to say is not, and I want to make it clear in the book, in the presentation, too, that the book is, not saying that figures like Giuliani, people who are these kind of ideologically driven people that are more on the political right, who really believe in the necessity of looking more toward the private sector and market and business and all of that, that's their central governing philosophy as more conservative figures. It's not that they aren't important. They're, of course, very important. But what I'm trying to show is kind of dig into the longer history of these processes so that, to take some of the focus off of just those ideologically led figures. So anyway, one of the things, what Giuliani does is he really steps on the gas, really, of these processes that had been at work for several decades. And what I'm trying to show, or what I try to show in the book is why part of why he is so successful at implementing policies that are increasingly looking, turning to the private sector and market is because that these processes weren't being invented when he comes into office in the mid 1990s, but in fact, were well underway for years and years. So just kind of going back to the park example, under Giuliani's tenure, that in 1997, that the city really formalizes its relationship with the Central Park Conservancy is one example, that they really, essentially take control of the park. At that point, that contract gets signed, it becomes much more formalized. Now, that process gets formalized in 1987, but that's only because it had already been ongoing for several decades, right? And so most of the examples that I'm chasing in each of the chapters of the book tell a kind of similar pattern of Giuliani really either formalizing or accelerating these various kinds of marketization processes that have been ongoing for years beforehand.
And how, I'm looking in the chat, we've got a question here. How does the scale of modern New York private industries compare to that of the 60s through 90s New York? And that kind of rhymes with a couple questions that were submitted ahead of time about kind of where we're at with marketization today. Is this sort of is it a one-way transition, or has there been any instances of things sort of being pulled back into the remit of local governments?
Yeah. So it's interesting because I think that is, I'll try to tackle both of those kind of questions. If you want me to elaborate on any part, I'd be happy to. So I think that we have in some ways, well, two things I would say, right? One is that oftentimes in these processes of marketization in many cities, it's not simply that the capacity of government is being completely shrunk. Right, that's happening in some cases, but in New York, for instance, the city government remains very, very large. I mean, it's larger now than it has ever been. But we simultaneously see various kinds of policies that have been implemented that, again, kind of increase the role of the private sector and market in providing various kinds of city services. So that is the kind of, and I think there too, I would add another point there too, that, this does tend to kind of, the pendulum of these processes of kind of moving from more robust government services towards to the kind of, more private sector and business, that pendulum has tended to swing back and forth a bit. I wouldn't say that, most of the most of the mayors in New York have continued to embrace this governing philosophy that have largely looked more to the private sector and market, and really continued with that after Giuliani was Mayor Mike Bloomberg, a business billionaire who certainly embraces that philosophy, right? But we've simultaneously seen some kind of slowing down of those processes under the subsequent mayor. Who, de Blasio, who, didn't kind of keep the same level of acceleration towards those processes. So there is a kind of swinging back and forth. Yeah, so those 2 points as a way of addressing some of those questions.
Thank you. And we've got a student. I'm going to unmute here momentarily once I can find him. Andrew had a question. Is that Andrew? Not Andrew Johnson. We've got multiple Andrews on the call. So.
Hello.
Oh, there you go.
Hi there. Great presentation. But I have so many questions for you. I'm going to try and keep it down to just hopefully nothing too long. Now, just as an exercise, I'm going to go a little bit tinfoil hat on you. I hope you'll forgive me for that. But it sounds like kind of the impetus for the park maintaining, like the grassroots movement to maintain the park, initially came from budget cuts to the park, which sounds like it's not wholly grassroots if there's this massive outside force that's kind of pushing it. Could you maybe explain the context of those budget cuts? I don't know New York history too well.
Yeah, no, right. So great point, right? So a couple things to say about that. So a lot of the budget cuts are taking place because of, the short answer is suburbanization. So you have a white, predominantly a white middle class population, especially in the 1950s, continuing in the 1960s, leaving New York. And that is coupled with corporations who are increasingly leaving New York. So the diminished tax base, right, is the major thing that's fueling those cutbacks. There's a couple other factors at work, but that's the kind of main cause of what's happening during that period, which is also a story that you could probably, especially for other cities in the Northeast, in the Midwest, a little less along the Sun Belt, because the Sun Belt is largely growing in this period, but is a kind of familiar process of what's happening with many cities across the country in the 50s and especially the 1960s into the 70s. Great, thanks.
Excellent. Did you have a follow-up, Andrew, or is that okay? We've got a thumbs up. There's a really good question in the chat from Verity.
Oh, sorry.
Oh,
I think
there is a follow-up.
I did have a follow-up, and I guess my follow-up is, I think part of what makes me so uncomfortable about parts of this this information is just the idea of private land that is supposed to be set aside for public use and benefit being used to generate a profit for a private or for a corporation. Can you tell us anything about Bryant Park Corp in terms of like what are they generating in profits? Is this a hugely profitable business, a marginally profitable one?
Yeah, so great question. So these aren't, it's not so much a profit, this is a complicated question. It has a lot to do with the sort of larger structure of nonprofits that grow across tremendously in the late 20th century and into the 21st century. So it has the kind of confusing name, Bryant Park Corporation. It is still a nonprofit, so technically they're not generating a profit. They still have the executives who are running the Bryant Park Corporation who are making, gobs of money. So there's certain people who are definitely profiting off of this process, right? And they are also generating a lot of money from those real estate assessments that are being happening on the property owners and the corporations that are on the blocks surrounding the park. They also do things like open up a restaurant in the park as a way to raise revenues. Famously, Bryant Park, one of the things that happens at Bryant Park increasingly kind of increases like commercial use of the park. So like the fashion show for years and years and years, the big fashion show that takes place in New York basically like shuts down the park for like 2 weeks at a time, which people raise questions about, like, is this really facilitating public access? So even if that money is largely going back into the park, I think it still raises questions about democratic accountability, even if it's not so much a profit-making enterprise. It is still a structure in which they are relying increasingly, in a way that the Parks Department had not, for instance, on these sort of commercial endeavors and other kind of mechanisms of fundraising and raising monies for the park that look a bit different than what had happened under municipal control.
It's a really interesting process. I feel like there's there's a healthy and warranted amount of cynicism in that notion that, well, the city can't help me, so we're going to have to do it ourselves. But then it seems like, and having read your book in its entirety, it's like repeatedly these people then kind of find their way into the open arms of different corporations who are happy to sort of build upon their grassworks DIY sort of initiatives and figure out sort of new and disgusting ways to commodify them.
Well, you said it well, but yeah, I think that's right, and especially like I was sort of emphasizing in the park example. Sometimes it actually takes some time to convince this sort of business corporations that they actually should support these doors that are being open to them to have a greater role in these kind of processes like parks or what have you. But exactly as you described, once they realize the kind of benefits that could come to them in doing so, that they really then kind of take over those processes, right? And often in a way that when these sort of grassroots groups or what have you were initially being formed, that the end results ends up being something that looks very different than they had ever foreseen. So there's a bit of kind of unintended consequences at work in a lot of these examples.
All right, next up, Verity has posed sort of a multi-part question in the chat, and I've asked her to articulate this question in her own words. Verity, are you unmuted? I take that as a no. Oh,
thank you.
there you
go. Okay. Hi. Thank you for talking to us. I guess it seems like you're coming at this from a multidisciplinary lens. So this is kind of like an economics-based question. So I just asked, looking at the park specifically through this lens, I was reminded of Eleanor Ostrom and Garrett Hardin's work in economics on common pool resources, and wondered if your work was analyzed through these perspectives at all. And if so, where you think this phenomena of privatization and simultaneous collectivization falls on the spectrum between these two opposing perspectives.
Wow, what a great question. I wish I could answer that. I don't, so I'm actually less familiar with that. I will fully admit my ignorance in that respect. I'm happy to hear more about it if you want to talk about it. But no, that may be the toughest question I've ever gotten in a talk. I'm just kidding. But no, I'm not equipped to answer that. Yeah.
Fair enough. Essentially, they just basically are on opposite ends of like the spectrum in terms of like analyzing common pool resources, which I think like the parks would like fall under that guise of like something that is like public, open to everybody, and so it seems like it really falls within that realm. Olstrom's perspective is more like, so she kind of like falls on like a more liberal, let's say, like end of things, looking towards like collectivization as a possibility in terms of like how to moderate the use of common pool resources. Whereas Hardin kind of relies on this very black and white economics only based perspective, whereas Ostrom, she was like had work in political science before, so she's more multidisciplinary. And Hardin essentially just said like that the only way for us to moderate common pool resources is through government and privatization. So I feel like it kind of falls in between those things.
Yeah, no, definitely. This is sort of like idea being that these sort of are that since there's not kind of direct ownership over them, that they sort of fall through the cracks, right? And everybody's sort of like taking responsibility for that sort of idea. Yeah. So yeah, no, I mean, I'll think more about that. No, I really appreciate that question, and I want to look more into that work and think more about it. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much.
That question actually reminds me of one of the anecdotes you conclude the book with about the privatization of parking in Chicago, and kind of the way to look at something like parking and sort of accessibility to cities as either as a potential market space that could be publicly owned or privately owned, or as a way of accessing a larger city that connects, people to businesses and has sort of a much larger sort of, a common good function, right? Yeah, I don't know if you want to talk about Chicago and parking, but when I read that, I was just like, oh my God, how have I not heard of this? I mean, it's insane.
Yeah, if the Chicago people will definitely talk to you about it if you have any in your orbit. Yeah, so just briefly, yeah, the idea being that not long ago, Chicago basically, yes, effectively privatize or enters into a contract with a private or group that effectively they take responsibility for all of the parking meters and the enforcement of kind of paid parking in the city, particularly in downtown. And so, on the one hand, that is just a horrific deal for the city. I mean, what they get from the contract. It's like now I'm forgetting the details, of course, but it's a multi-decade long contract, and the private organization basically get their money back within 3 years or something ridiculous. I mean, it's just a terrible deal for the city. And then I think it raises the question too. Okay, well, maybe there are, and this is often as a concern with privatization. I think people who have kind of thought about this deal is not just that this is a bad deal for the city, but also if we think about, is the importance of parking, to monetize and to produce as much commerce and funds from, that from parking, or is there something to be said for maybe encourage, even if it was under city control, maybe raising less capital from parking, but seeing the ability to provide parking for low cost as a kind of important municipal service, right? As being able to facilitate transportation in and out of the city, right? And that sort of also becomes lost through a process of privatization. So again, it's just also kind of trying to ask us to think a little bit about both whether privatization is always good in terms of a deal, but also some of the larger questions that get raised through these processes that also, might even go beyond the kind of economic argument to what the function of, the kind of public good that a city government is supposed to provide, and how well that gets served when a service is turned over to a business, a for-profit business.
Yeah, it's asking us to ascribe value to something in extra economic terms, right? Which is something that neoliberalism has a really hard time doing, right?
Mm-hmm.
Something's valuable because it's tangibly valuable, but it's
right.
like, oh no, there are other ways to quantify value. So we've got Raul in the chat has posed an interesting question, and I just unmuted them. So Raul, would you mind expressing your question?
Hi, yeah. Hi, Dr. Holtzman. So I read this, and it might be a little bit biased because I read it on the Investopedia's website, but it talked about possible downsides of neoliberalism. And one of them that I mentioned was economic inequality and then indifference to the needs and well-being of individuals. But I didn't really see that in your book, in your presentation, and in the meaning of just looking up neoliberalism as well. It seems like it is more of trying to solve a problem with both the private and the government as well. So are there any laws or rules where you use where it's required to use neoliberalism in our government? If you can give me maybe an example.
Yeah. So no, I think that you're raising an interesting point, and I appreciate you doing so. There's not necessarily any kind of imperative. I mean, the term neoliberalism is less. It's a complicated term in part because you would be hard pressed to find somebody who actually identifies as a neoliberal in a kind of strict sense. It's more a term that kind of gets thrown around to ascribe a certain governing or either a change that has been reflected in governing philosophies, especially since the late 20th century and into the 21st century, that is about, that really prioritizes reliance on the market and private sector, and especially kind of is looking to the market to increasingly enlarge the role of the market in various facets of life. So you wouldn't necessarily, or nothing necessarily immediately comes to mind in terms of legal imperatives that are requiring this as a kind of being enacted into law, but it is for various reasons, some of which I touched on the talk, something that we have seen kind of increasingly be embraced at the local and federal level as a kind of governing influence or governing philosophy since the late 20th century. So I take your point about the sort of well-being of individuals and the extent to which, if I'm understanding your point correctly, that is or is not being accounted for in the talk. I mean, one of the ways I might answer that is, I think if we see the transformation of who's caring for parks in terms of, well, these corporation or these private nonprofit groups are increasingly caring for parks, and the park conditions in these kinds of parks in business districts of Manhattan, that those conditions are improving, that isn't that actually benefiting lots of individuals, right? So on the one hand, that's an argument I think that is more aligned with kind of what you're saying, and I think that there's a real point to that, and I think that's a serious point. But what I was trying to do, especially towards the end of the park, is also think about if we think about this change on more of a kind of structural level of the ways in which when a service gets increasingly turned over or a previous municipal service increasingly relies on the private sector and market, gets marketized, that there is that the market kind of inherently benefits those who have greater kinds of resources. And so if we think about it at a more kind of structural level, then we see something like the park system of the wealthy being able to care for the parks more in their areas than lower income communities can. So on an individual level, it kind of depends on where you're positioned in that system. If the city is cutting back parks funding because it's increasingly looking to the private sector and wealthy to fund parks, that's going to be a system that inherently privileges the people who already have access to kind of resources, and people without them are going to be at the short end of that kind of equation. So that's what I'm trying to describe. If that made some sense.
Yeah, that did. That helped a lot. Yeah, thank you.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm reminded of your chapter on local policing and sort of the rise of private security and the way that sort of the privatization or sort of the emergence of increased private security forces kind of provided safety. I think your line was, it provided safety for the citizens who could afford it, right?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And it, well, yeah. I don't need to interject there. Yeah. No, right. Exactly. Yeah.
Excellent. Nathaniel had a question and was going to pose it himself here.
Yeah, mine was kind of like a multi-part question, kind of based on the first question I posed at the beginning on the exponential growth of privatization. Do we see kind of a shift now with COVID-19 and the ideas of like communal identity and collectivization, and mutual aid programs? Are these becoming more prevalent because of COVID-19, and are people kind of shifting back towards this communal identity? And kind of going off of that too, are there people taking advantage of those ideas of mutual aid and trying to privatize that itself as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, you've touched on, like, we could talk about this for much more time than we have, because I think this is like so key, right? And there's a couple things I can say about that. So, I mean, I don't think there's a couple of things I would say about that. So just in terms of the latter, I mean, I do think that one of the things that if you read the book, that will come across, or that probably comes across in the presentation, and even more so in the book, is the capacity for more elites for elite figures to shape initiatives and reorient them in their kind of favor, right? So if you kind of talk about the ways that elites being able to use even mutual aid projects to their benefit, right? That is probably a theme that I talk about in the book in terms of the ability for these initiatives that were launched at the grassroots to over time be increasingly influenced and reshaped by more elite figures. So that certainly is something that I chronicle in the book, and certainly something that I think is always a concern. But the mutual aid point, is an interesting one, and I think that the kinds of mutual aid projects that we saw or have seen during COVID, those have existed previous to COVID and are really, really vital, right? Like those kinds of projects that are out there in communities providing various kinds of resources that that they see as the government, maybe not providing, right, can often be kind of life-saving, right? Like that's really critical. But I do think there simultaneously is a question, because there has been, this is a debate, I think, on the left of late, or particularly in terms of the sort of far left, right? Like, do you try to create projects like these mutual aid projects that try to fill in the gap of government and aren't really trying to challenge the government to do more, right? But are designed to provide kinds of services at the community level, let's say, out of a real need in that community, that could do a lot of good, but that aren't ultimately reorienting resources that government could provide, right? I don't know if I'm doing a great job of explaining this, but the idea there being like that those mutual aid projects are so vital, so important, so wonderful. But I think that when they are the only solution, or that when too much activity or too much emphasis gets put on them, then we lose a kind of larger fight about, kind of allowing the government services and the billions and billions of dollars and resources that the government has to simply go in a different direction, right? So I think that the fight also needs to be to reorient public services and directions of government, and not just to be working on projects that exist outside government, but to be continually challenging government to do, a more equitable job of providing resources. That was a little more convoluted than I was hoping, but hopefully that made a little bit of sense. And I think it's a really, really great question and point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that point that you kind of finished off it is that, the government can take advantage of these mutual aid programs because they can say, like, oh, these people are getting taken care of by the community, so we can continue to neglect the community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as one example. Yeah, no, right. Thank you. Yeah.
Wow, these were some excellent questions. Just absolutely blown away. I realize that it's now pressing 10:30 out on the East Coast, and I want to be mindful of your time. So how about one last round of applause for our guest tonight, Benjamin Holtzman? The book is absolutely fantastic. I feel like we barely scraped the surface. This entire conversation was about one chapter of this book, and it's just I cannot recommend it enough. So glad you came, zoomed in this evening, and I just hope, I hope more people get a hold of this book and check out your work.
Oh, thank you. That's really, really kind. And I just want to thank you all again. These are really, really fantastic questions. I appreciate you sticking through this for an hour and a half. And I also just want to, again, thank Alex Miller. You have, all of you have such an asset in the kind of programming and work and teaching that he's doing at your institution, and I'm very grateful for the work that he does, and I know that all of you are as well. So I just want to also conclude by thanking all of you and thanking all of his efforts in putting this together, along with the stellar lineup that you all are experiencing this fall. So great. So thanks again, everyone.
Excellent throw. Join us next week when we'll have David Bacon will be zooming in to share his unbelievable photojournalism and recent book, More Than a Wall. Very exciting stuff. So thanks again. And Ben, I will definitely be reaching out shortly. Okay.
Fantastic.
Excellent. You all have a great evening, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Bye.